it's very important when you are looking at firearms to understand some of the more commonly used terms. And people have a lot of terms when they talk about triggers.
Well, hey, we're a gunner talking about triggers. Because I was going to, I emailed Maggie last night, like, here's some talking points. And I was going to ask you what your favorite trigger is. But then we started talking about the Hudson or the Daniel Defense H9 and its trigger. And I just kind of wanted to just a general overview of kind of the different types of triggers, really, because there's so many different types. And even with the Daniel Defense one, like that's one would argue a new style of trigger to some degree.
It is unusual.
It's definitely unusual. So I think, so let's just kind of talk about triggers for a little bit. Let's start with the revolver. How about that? Yeah.
So revolver triggers. Triggers in general are pretty polarizing, and there's a lot of debate over which trigger is better than another.
A lot of personal preference there.
That's exactly what it is, because if there was one that was far better than any others, that would be the only design ever used on any firearms. And we have multiple different styles of triggers here, which means that is obviously not the case.
Kind of try to grab as many as we can.
And
I'm sure there's a bunch we're missing here.
We are. We're missing a number of things too out there that are unique, unusual, and we're just looking here at the small arms, the handguns.
Well,
really.
and so for a revolver, and this is kind of fascinating, because if you really go back to the beginning of a revolver, there was only, for the most part, one type, which would be
single action
only, meaning you had to manually pull back the action, and then that's just that tiny little pull.
It means that the trigger was only doing the one singular action of hitting the firing pin, striking the firing pin.
There's just nothing to that. You just touch it.
Yeah.
And it pulls. Versus a double action, which you got to pull all the way through to get that hammer to come back.
And that has some weight to it.
And that was actually more recent technology.
Yeah.
Being able to do that.
This is the double action trigger.
It's heavy and it's long.
It is. People do not like it. The common complaint is that it's hard to pull the trigger. And when you're pulling the trigger, it is hard
to
keep that firearm on target. So that is
So you're more accurate like that.
You are. However, please don't carry like that. That's really not.
Yeah, you can't carry.
You practice, or when you shoot competitively, when you're shooting for bragging rights or for money at the range and with friends and everything like that in your safe space, you don't carry with them cocked back like that.
Well, and the double action, it takes a lot of practice. But I think that's like a lot of times I like the idea of revolver, because I could pull that hammer back if I really want to get a long distance, great accurate shot. Or if you need to draw and shoot real fast, you just pull it. You don't have to worry about a manual safety.
No, pull point shoot.
Pull point shoot, yeah.
It's right there. All the guesswork is gone. I love it. So moving on from that, I guess.
I was going to wonder where you go from there. I was going to go to the 1911.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Because it was kind of the next technology, really. Like, this was the next viable technology that was used worldwide.
It was, yeah. So this actually replaced the revolver in military use, because the idea was that if you were sitting on a horse in the cavalry and you dropped your heckin' revolver out of your holster or out of your saddlebags or something, then it could discharge if it hit the hammer on the back. And horses are expensive. They're still expensive today. They were expensive back in those days as well. You didn't freaking shoot your horse. It was awful. So you needed something for military use that would not endanger any of your other people around you, or your livestock, your cattle, your horses, your transportation. Don't freaking damage your transportation. So you get the 1911. And this one works on a principle very similar to it's single action. This is actually a single action firearm, but instead of you manually cocking this back every single time, the force of the operation of the slide moving this back will cock that hammer back for you every time.
Well, and the trigger itself is, whereas in this is a rotating, like on a top hinge, this goes straight back. When you disassemble
these, the trigger mechanism inside this looks different than modern firearms. It's just a delightful and unique animal, and I think so far, and I was late to this 1911 party. The rest of you guys that have already been there for decades, thanks for making room for us new kids. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And thanks for being patient with us.
Well, new is in the last couple decades.
Yeah, this was not on my radar at all when I was first looking into firearms. But I have developed
Well, you fairly regularly carry a 1911 too.
I really love the trigger on it. I am in deep Smith.
Most argue this is one of the nicest triggers around. Is the 1911 trigger, because it's kind of like the single action of the Revolver, but just being able to pull it straight back versus hinged. It's a really nice trigger. It's a really
light,
nice trigger. But that's your only option, is single action only.
Right.
Single action only, every shot.
Yes.
Let's go to the double action, single action from there.
So from there, then you wind up with a hammer fired model.
Even though we've cleared these, I'm kind of...
We still do this
I'm like the guy, I always make sure my door's locked 3 or 4 times. Like, I do the same thing. I gotta check it every time.
What you don't know is these have already been cleared 7 times. Yeah. These will be cleared 7 more times.
And too, like if I go to a gun store and I say, "Hey Maggie, can I see that gun?" and you pull it out, and you always clear it. But even as I see you clear it and you hand it to me, I still clear it again.
So this trigger right here.
So here was really kind of the next level, really. I mean, because this kind of came after then the 1911 was the double action, single action, which is the hammers down with ammo and battery. But the first round is going to be your double action, whereas you pull the trigger, it pulls that hammer back.
Heavy trigger pull.
But then, like the 1911, every round after that,
each round will then cycle your slide.
We'll cycle that hammer back. So then, every shot after that.
Every shot after that is going to be a nice light single action trigger pull. So then it's closer to the 1911. However, you are still hinged up at the top. Instead of a straight pull back, you have this crescent shaped hinge to it. So if you are comfortable and familiar with revolvers, a hammer fired double action, single action semi-auto pistol would be an awesome next step up. It's going to be a very intuitive trigger for you at that point.
This is one of my favorite style of triggers, just because I feel because I like shooting Revolver. I like a first shot double action pull. It makes me feel safe. I don't have to worry about having a manual safety on it. I like it, but again, all these are preferences.
It really is. This is just an opinion. So it's
kind of like a Revolver first shot, 1911, every after that.
Right. It's a little bit, it's unusual and different. I wish we could talk about this gun for a minute, because at some point, what we were playing with here, this is made by the company CZ, and this was a discontinued model. This was their 2075 Rammy, and I am really looking forward to seeing this firearm re-released by CZ with some modern upgrades, maybe some different materials or something like that.
I kind of catch up with the micro compound.
We're going. So they've discontinued this. I have a feeling that somewhere down the line in the future we will see some sort of re-release of this, because this firearm was just way too cool, and I think a little bit ahead of its time. Wise. So then moving on, let's talk about everybody's favorite.
And then came the Glock trigger.
Pardon me while I just fall off the chair and go somewhere else. No.
Not a fan of the Glock trigger, are you?
I wish, I want to like it. I really do.
Because you own a Glock, so it's not like you're just being,
No.
like
I hate the trigger gives me blisters. Okay, and I'm not the only...
People say that. Let's talk about it for a second. So the Glock trigger, they put, because I remember when Glock first came out and a friend bought one of these.
Yeah.
And I never even heard of it.
Yeah.
This is a long time ago. By the way, this is like 90s, somewhere in the early 90s.
These came out in the 80s.
And he showed me this because I asked him, I was like, well, where's the safety? Because every gun at that point probably had a safety somewhere, because we were used to 1911s and things like that, And he's like, oh, it's right here, So what they did was they put the safety, the manual safety, one would argue, here, so the trigger can't be pressed unless you depress this button first.
Yeah.
But then it's almost like, I would argue that a striker-fired handgun is, now the Glock trigger is not like this, but it's really like a bolt rifle. It's a pin. It's a pin that's back, kind of like a bolt rifle. Mm-hmm. The trigger is not like a bolt rifle at all.
No.
I'm just saying it's kind of the same idea. And then, so you don't need much to just release that pin forward. There's a lot more to it than obviously a bolt rifle.
It really is, and it comes into play. This one utilizes a lot of safeties, but all of them start with the trigger. Rule number 1, until you check every single gun is loaded. So rule number 2, do not put your finger on the trigger until you are absolutely certain that you are ready to destroy what is on the business end of that barrel, and that the firearm is in fact loaded or unloaded. Then you can address the trigger at your leisure, but please check first before you do that. Check, triple check, quadruple check. You set it down, you turn around, you blink your eyes, you look back at it again, check it again, please. It's a really excellent, amazing
I was okay
habit
with
to
destroying
get
your
into.
computer for I was okay with that. I would have felt bad. I would have bought you a new computer, but I was okay with it.
I would not feel bad about destroying the computer at all either. My cousin would have different ideas about that. I'm so sorry, Brian.
Now, and this trigger hinges at the top to, and I would argue the 1911 trigger is way better. The single action on the Revolver is way better. The single action on the CZ is way better. And some would argue it's a double, it's not a double action. You're not pulling back anything for more energy, but it does have a little bit of creep. But it's a very small, light trigger. There's not much to it.
There's one of those words you will hear in trigger talk again, creep. Mm-hmm. Do you want to go over what that is?
Yeah, so I guess it's like this distance, kind of like you're pulling the trigger and nothing's happening as you continue to go. And then all of a sudden, and you'll kind of feel nothing happen, and then you hit a wall. Suddenly you hit something. And then you're there. And as soon as you pull it a little bit further, that's when it fires. So that's my best description.
I think that is a very accurate description. So it is the displacement, the rearward displacement of the trigger before it breaks that sear and the back, before you get to that click. How long is that creep before you hit that click? Oh my gosh! Then this is. I feel like I'm totally not the right person to be talking to on this because
you're always so modest. And you know more than you think you know.
Because
everybody's always like, Maggie knows so much.
You have like creep, and then you have take up, and they're two different things, and they're not supposed to be confused. Because
I would argue because would take up be more like a revolver pull? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
That's
like a double action pull versus this.
So the take up would be like on, from what I've read. I think I need way more in.
We could talk about take up another time.
Take up and creep.
Let's put that in another video.
We're gonna do all of this.
Maybe comment below. What's the difference between take up and creep?
Jesus.
So then along came and we were talking about this gun, which kind of led us to kind of say, well, what's going on with these? And again, we're not hitting all the triggers, but this is like kind of a cross between the Glock trigger and a 1911 trigger with its own little twist to it where it has
this design.
I love this design too.
I
actually might argue this is the best design.
This is so cool.
This is the Daniel H9 based off of the Hudson H9. But it's a 1911 trigger, meaning it goes straight back.
It's a straight pull trigger.
It's flat, but it's got the trigger safety like the Glock, but instead of being a little pin that sticks out,
dingus
is what we determined that was called.
Your dingus.
It rotates from the bottom instead of the top, kind of like every other trigger in the world. And then it's flat, and then that is so that I would argue that's take up. Would you say that what you mean by take up? Because there's no creep to that. You're pulling it. You're pulling a distance, and then everything after that. Then you got the creep.
Jeez Louise.
And then you got it's really this is a great trigger. So this is kind of like an evolution. This is new this year. Hudson had, now theirs was a bottom rotating safety too. So this is from 2017.
Yeah. So they wanted to find a way that you could put that trigger dingus and that trigger safety in there. So I have also, been misinformed. It's not, get your finger on there and move that out of this is get your finger on there and it does move this out of the way. But what this dingus actually does is it prevents jarring movement from moving your trigger.
Which is why the P320 would fire.
Jarring, harsh, very fast movement being dropped or something like that. And if it's heavy, so that little dingus that sits in the trigger of these. And in fact, let's look at this one because you do have some brands that will put a different
that
material.
To me looks kind of the same idea.
And a different color. So this is the same thing as a Glock, the same idea as a Glock, but this is by a company called Canic. And what they have done is they have added a different material and a different color to the dingus. It's still hinged. You still see where it's hinged in there. And it still prevents the firearm from engaging the trigger when this firearm is loaded or unloaded and dropped from any remarkable distance that has been, they have drop tests that they have to do on this. So
I would argue this is probably, this is generally a vast majority of your handguns are going to fall within this realm somewhere.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this, just to kind of close out. What's your favorite style of trigger of all these?
Not the Glock.
Okay.
Not the Glock. Please, not the Glock for me. Everyone else, you can have the Glock. I love it. Have it. Take it. It's yours. It's yours. Go for it. Not for me. I hate that. The dingus in there is just a pain in the rear. It wants to just come back and I feel it hit my finger. It can make my finger go numb at times, and having a tingly trigger finger is not a pleasant sensation.
Which one do you like?
I like the 1911 triggers. I love the Revolver triggers in single and double action. I have a hammer fired single action, double action that I really, really appreciate and like. And so I like the trigger on that. I own a Canic. And I own a Glock. And I still prefer the trigger on the Canic over the Glock. They do the same thing to me, and I'm not appreciative of it. I do not like that thin blade in the center of the trigger. It can pinch the skin on your finger, the meat of your finger, and leave you blisters, cut you open, and then you're shooting with a little Band-Aid on your trigger finger, which is not really fun.
I've seen that happen to other people.
This is awesome!
I love that.
So the Daniel Defense and the Hudson have really they have made that little trigger safety as wide as the entire
And flat.
safety.
Yeah.
It still sits within the center of the trigger, but it is now as wide as the whole trigger and as flat as it needs to be. We've had this technology. This is not new technology. We could have done this anywhere else.
And a lot of people, most people know all the stuff we talk, because they know these terms. But there's a lot of new gun owners out there and people looking at new guns. I think it's important to find stuff that people
Pay
like.
attention to this. This is cool.
Yeah.
So, that is really,
Awesome.
definitely awesome.